Joining me now is Warren Hogan, Professor at the UTS Business School, former Chief Economist at ANZ. Warren, thanks so much for your time. What do you make of the events of the last 24, 48 hours on the markets?
Well, I think, Kieran, it's good news that we've seen some stability come through, and it's good news that we're moving to sort of phase 2 policy response here globally, and that is the fiscal policy response, and markets have clearly taken some comfort from that. Now it's time to see what that fiscal policy response looks like. The President, as you just showed, has outlined a couple of ideas or measures they're looking at, and of course our government's all lined up to release something on Thursday. So markets are now waiting for that. We had the monetary policy response last week. That doesn't seem to have done anything too constructive. Now it's fiscal policy's turn, and we'll see how that goes.
If it's not handled well, could it turn into a financial crisis?
Look, I think this is one of the real issues right now, is what are the sort of second-order effects of this shock to the global economy. I think the markets have reacted to the first-order effects, the big hits to travel and probably demand in the world economy, and that's been the big repricing of the last couple of weeks. Now it's about what sort of flow-on effects there are, and you can hear from what the government here is saying, what the Prime Minister and the Treasurer are saying, is they're trying to stop this turning into a rout in the jobs market. They're going to aim some of these measures straight at keeping people in jobs, and I think that's sort of what was coming through with President Trump. That's the second-order effect on the economy. The second-order effect we've got to worry about is these financial moves create problems in the financial system, ones that aren't always very obvious. And I think at this stage we're not seeing too much, but if we get another disappointment on the policy front, i.e. this fiscal policy announcements coming through in the next few days, and markets fall again, then we will get more insight into whether there's any financial vulnerabilities that could be revealed.
And so in terms of the best case scenario, let's look at the scenarios for the Australian economy, both best case and worst case scenarios in your view.
Well, I think the best case we're going to see is the damage to the economy is going to be limited to those initial impacts. So, you know, we're going to have some shock to demand. People aren't going to be spending as much. They're not going to be going out to restaurants, cafes, going on holidays, all that sort of thing. Here in Australia, we've had a few impacts already directly out of China in relation to tourism and education. There's nothing we can do about that. It's just that those impacts flow through, but they don't have the big second-order effects on jobs and employment. We don't get a big rise in the unemployment rate or any substantive rise. What that means is maybe a technical recession. Maybe we do get sort of 2 quarters of negative growth, but very mild, and we can get out of it quickly. And I think that's really the government's hope and aim with their policy. The bad case, of course, is that we start to see all the sort of cracks in the system start to appear, and that's we see companies shedding labour, people losing their job. That sort of causes more concern. Consumer confidence, reported by ANZ Warren Hogan today, collapsed. I mean, if we get job losses on top of that, that's going to put more concern out there. And of course, as I referred to earlier, if we start to see any imbalances that have built up in the financial sector globally in the last 10 years, and I think, you know, we could go into that in quite some detail about the potential for that. But if that starts to unravel and we get a financial crisis, then, you know, it's a whole new ballgame. We've got a genuine recession. And we've got it at a time when there's not a lot of policy flexibility. Global interest rates are already near zero, so there's not a lot of monetary policy.
So in that context then, and I know you touched on it a bit earlier, but if you can elaborate, what can the government's fiscal stimulus package, which is going to be announced later this week, what can that achieve?
I think they need to err on the side of doing too much and really shoring up confidence and shoring up demand. So I think their initial instinct to go targeted is exactly right. Hone in on the industries that are under stress, to go into areas where job shedding could happen more easily, i.e. small, medium enterprise, to target in on cash flow there, seems to be what they're doing. So I think all of that sort of, the gist of those targeted policies is exactly right. The concern I have is that they seem to be sort of stuck in this mode that, you know, what the Labor Party did in the GFC was wasteful. The problem with trying to stimulate an economy that's been hit by a severe shock is that you sort of can't be too targeted. You need to throw money at the economy. You need to sort of put a blanket of the stimulus across the economy. And I worry that they're not going to do that. They're talking about cash handouts for New Start and for pensioners, which is great. That's going to get into the economy very quickly. But I think they've got to make sure that they get enough out there across the broad economy, because you don't do enough and you worry too much about wasting money. I mean, I think it's a very nebulous concept when it comes to macroeconomic policy stimulus. I mean, when there's a rate cut, every variable mortgage holder gets the benefit of it, even if they need it or not. You can't be too targeted with these things. So, we'll wait and see what happens on Thursday, but I think that's the risk, is they don't do enough.
And what is the key for the economy then in terms of sustaining its growth, avoiding a recession and avoiding too much of the fallout that you warned about? What is the key parameter that we need to watch?
It is jobs, jobs and jobs. It's all about employment or unemployment and to some extent underemployment. I mean, the one thing that's a little bit new for our economy is the sort of the rise of the casualisation, the rise of the gig economy, this sort of thing. And you know, you've already seen some companies say they're going to be cutting back on consultants, and I mean, I think a lot of the workforce around hospitality and that sort of is casual. And you know, I think just limiting the damage to people's incomes and also limiting the amount of job losses. That's going to determine whether or not this is a sort of a modest hit to the economy, which isn't going to be nice, and we will get through it though, or whether or not we're going to start setting off some self-reinforcing forces where people lose their job, then they stop spending, and then that causes more problems, that people lose jobs and so on and so forth. So it's all about jobs.
And is there any room for the RBA to move further? I know that we're down to record lows. Where do they get to the point that they say, no, in terms of rates, we're done, we have to look at other unconventional measures like quantitative easing and so on?
Yeah, well, look, I think that's going to, well, it is already the debate in financial markets where they worry very much about what it actually means from an execution point of view. And I think more generally we'll start talking about that, particularly if, you know, financial markets and the economy doesn't respond to this fiscal policy announcement. I mean, the GFC, Australian interest rates were over 7%, and the RBA was one of the first central banks to do a super cut of over 100 points, I think, if memory serves. We just don't have that now. They can cut again, but it's 25 basis points. It's nothing really in the scheme of things. So look, I don't know the unconventional monetary policy, which is essentially putting money into the system by buying long-term government bonds. I don't think it's going to do much for this economy. In the US, the mortgage rate is tied to the 10-year bonds. So when the Fed in the US buys 10-year bonds and does unconventional policy, it reduces mortgage rates directly. We don't do that. Our mortgage rates are linked to the RBA cash rate. So it's not going to do a lot here. So I actually see an even bigger emphasis on this fiscal policy from the government, because monetary policy has pretty much run its course.